let's go for the finale, okay? Welcome to our last run on this course. We are going to now review the big model, the third model. I mean, this paper gives us 3 models. Isn't that amazing? We got the Fisherian flexible price model, then we got the New Keynesian model that we've used to understand, oh no, there is now persistence in inflation. And now they actually have a third model here in this model, in this paper. I mean, it's like almost too good to be true. Right? And that is now what they call the quantitative general equilibrium model. And this is something that happens a lot in recent research in economics and at the frontier, that you use a small model to uncover a mechanism. To uncover, this is at the core of a theory, that can, the idea is that, fiscal inflation, monetary inflation, right? You're trying to use the simplest setup to make your point. But then, of course, what that's going to trigger is that the professional is going to ask, I understand now very well why we get inflation sometimes and why we don't get inflation sometimes. I get that. But what you are telling me, is this quantitatively relevant? Is this just a qualitative curiosity that is kind of fun to think about? Or is this something that actually is quantitatively relevant that drives the data? And that's what many papers then show in the last step. They take their little core, their nucleus, and plant that into a bigger model that actually shows, is this idea quantitatively relevant? And that's what they do in this now. So this is the here they are, here this is their quantitative general equilibrium model. This is now, they compare, is this relevant in the data? Okay, that's basically the question. Is this relevant in the data? That is the billion-dollar question. They simply want to, they had to convince apparently the editor and the referees whether this whole thing is quantitatively important or not. It could be that it is quantitatively completely unimportant. But, right? I mean, it's a nice mechanism, but it's relevant to think about inflation in the data. Or it may be very relevant, and so that's what they do. All right, so now, what they now do is, they take the New Keynesian model that we studied before the break, and they actually expand that. They make that model bigger. In particular, they are putting in 2 agents, hand to mouth and recurrent. So they have agents that are eating their income, and then they have agents that are smoothing consumption over time. So those are the 2 agents. Very similar to the climate model. There are differences, right? The microclimate model had these people with poor, with low productivity and high productivity, and you could switch between this, right? That was the macroclimate model. Here, they don't allow the switching. They are, saying you're permanently hand to mouth, and you're permanently recurring. That's the first. Second, they are adding taxes to this, in the sense that they have distortionary taxes. So one thing you may have thought about when you read this, or when we discussed this, so far we considered lump sum taxes, right? The tau was a lump sum tax. And now what they do is they do distortionary taxes, so a proportional tax on capital and labor income. So they also add capital now, okay? I mean, so this is like, they have, the first bullet should be, to be really precise, the first bullet should be here, they have now capital accumulation. So they have capital accumulation, and then they have, of course, labor and capital income, and you pay distortionary tax. So, for instance, the labor income tax is something like, what you're going to get is you're going to get, 1 minus tau n times WT times NT. That is your post-tax labor income, where the tau is the distortionary labor income tax. That's the idea. And then there's a similar expression for your capital income. It's like 1 minus tau k RTK times KT, which is, this is your rental income from renting out your capital, and you are, that's the distortionary tax on that. So it's bigger than model. It's more realistic, but it's bigger. Then they have not only price rigidities, not only sticky prices, but they also have sticky wages. So they have unions that are adjusting the wages infrequently. So wages are adjusted once in a while. So this model is really getting serious. Then they have these hand-to-mouth consumers, right? So they have the people that are eating their period T income right away. They're not being, they don't save it, they cannot borrow. They have this, they're working, and at the end of the day they get their paycheck, and then they eat all the resources because it's so little to get food, and then they repeat the next day and the next day. The last thing, and that's really cool, now when you look at the simple model, there were essentially two features that are maybe off-putting to some people. First, the lump sum taxes. We are not living in a world with lots of lump sum taxes. Most of our taxes are proportional or even progressive, income taxes, right? So that has been taken care of here. But then the other feature of the simple model is that this was one period government debt. The debt matures in 1 quarter, which is of course also when you want to talk about the data, not so attractive, right? We know governments are issuing 5, 10, 30-year government debt, maturities. And so that's why they also have long-term bonds now. So they allow for the government debt to mature in the future. To basically, in the future that is longer than 1 quarter. So that's the key. Okay. So then, you take it from there. Then they add to this typical business cycle shocks. So what are those business cycle shocks? Those are technology shocks. And monetary policy shocks. And so they add a bunch of shocks to this model, just what we did in this course so far in the macro climate model and in the basic New Keynesian model. And then there's more shocks, but the idea is, right, so this is not now just a model focusing on fiscal policy, but they have lots of other shocks. And then they also put in a shifter to the Phillips curve. How did we call that shock in our course so far? What was the name that we gave to this shock? It's a cost push shock, exactly. That's what we call the cost push shock. You guys know this inside out now, okay? So that is a cost push shock. It is a cost push shock. So there is now a larger set of shocks that they have. So this model is serious. That's a serious model. Serious in the sense that, I think there's lots of elements of realism in terms of the economy we're living in. And it's really putting the model to a test. Is this model getting anywhere close to the data? Or can the model deliver, is the fiscal inflation going to survive in that model? Okay. Now the one thing that you have to now understand is they are not working with funded or unfunded tax shocks anymore. But they're working with funded and unfunded transfer shocks now. That's the one step that you need to make. So the two drivers that are now present in this economy are now changes in transfers. So these are transfers to households rather than taxes. I'm going to write this down in a second, but in terms of notation, right, they keep the zeta, right? They keep the zeta, and the z means transfers, and then they have a funded transfer shock and an unfunded transfer shock. That's the idea. So in terms of the simple model, let me write down the government budget constraint for the simple model. So in the simple model, or in the Fisherian model, these transfers would show up in the following way. The government has revenues as before by selling government debt. Okay, so that's the revenue. That's not going to change. And the government would pull in taxes, okay? And this is the Fisherian model, so this is still lump sum taxes. Then they have expenditures. The government has expenditures. In particular, it has expenditures for repaying the debt from the previous period. And now what they do is they say, oh, there's another source of expenditures that the government has. And in particular, it's going to have this zeta z comma tm plus zeta z comma tf. That's the idea. So they are essentially looking at now changes in transfers that are funded or not. So the government pays out to Tu and Hui, and the question is, how much is this funded by future tax increases? So if, for instance, there is an increase in transfers, is this funded or backed by future increases in taxes? Or is it not, and the price level has to do its job? That's the idea. So everything goes through to what we have discussed before, except now you have to think transfers. Now, why do they want to do this with transfers? Well, they argue the CARES Act in 2020, the ARPA Act in 2021, and in the 1960s and 70s, all this was essentially big transfers to households. So when COVID hit, the way to think what the US government did is it actually pushed transfers into households. I mean, Donald Trump, he sent checks to American citizens. In 2020, in March, he wrote checks, and every US person, every citizen in the United States got a check, I think, of about $2,000 US, and in the mail. And that's a transfer to households. That's what this is actually means. So, and because it would be weird to think about COVID as a cut in taxes, because that really didn't happen so much. Taxes weren't really cut as much as people were given transfers. They were given money. And that's how we have to think about that. Okay? Any questions to that? The rest is very similar to the setup that we had before now, right? There is now, this is a rewritten form of this capital B here, right? There is this unfunded debt and this funded debt, and they have similar policy parameters for the two Taylor rules, for the Taylor rule and the fiscal rule. All that is the same now. So the big change is essentially this kind of setup here that we have in terms of the two agents, distortion taxes, real wage, utilities, and so forth. Now, when you want to formalize that, in their main slides, they only have one formalization, but in the appendix, they have many more equations. But, for instance, this is the normal interest rate rule, the Taylor rule they're working with. And you guys should be very happy to see that. Forget about this max operator for now. And this is the Taylor rule that you've seen, for instance, in the macro climate model. The normal interest rate that the central bank sets is a function of the past period's interest rate. That's the interest rate smoothing that we discussed in the macro climate model. And then they have an argument, they are responding to an output gap measure, but here is the difference of inflation from fiscal inflation. That's the, so it's a more complicated Taylor rule, but it's the whole idea of that the central bank responds to this rather than inflation from steady state. That's the key assumption that they did there. Okay? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that you have there's one more thing, which is this one, and that's basically the zero lower bound. So that's, we're not going to be talking about this, but this is the zero lower bound. Okay? So they changed the monetary policy rules so that, for instance, in a deep recession, suppose this really falls like a rock, output falls like a rock, then you could end up with a negative interest rate. And this max operator prevents that from happening. Okay? So this interest rate rule is respecting the so-called zero lower bound, that whatever interest rate is, it can only fall until zero. It cannot go negative. Okay? That's what this is, but beyond the scope of our course. And then they have all these fiscal rules, right? These are these fiscal rules, and they have a fiscal rule for the distortionary labor and capital income tax. They have a fiscal rule for government spending. So now this model, right, has y is equal to c plus I plus g. That's what this model now has. So this model has output is used for consumption purposes, for investment purposes on physical capital, and for government spending. And they model government spending as an AR1 process that has some endogeneity on debt. So these are fiscal rules, and the idea is that whenever there's too much debt, the government starts to raise taxes or cut spending, right? That's why the minus sign is there. So these are fiscal rules, but it's not only depending on the actual debt to on the level of debt from the previous period, but in relation to some fiscal inflation. The fiscally led environment for that. The same idea. The lion's share of the analysis, though, is focused on this one, folks. This is where all the meat is in terms of the analysis. In the sense that we have these two transfer shocks now, right? And there is a rule for the transfer shocks that has some resistance in it. And look here, you guys should love this now. Maybe you hate it by now because I've talked too much about it. But this is exactly the same setup as we had in the Fisherian model. That is now how much debt is in excess of the fiscally led level of debt. So that's those two, so in other words, this is like, let me maybe circle this, right? This and that is as in the Fisherian. The rest is like frills on the carpet. Like makes it look nice, but that's like in the Fisherian. Okay, so that's the formalization of the policy rules, super important. And then what they also give you is they give you this technical appendix, right? They give you this technical appendix where they actually list all the model equations and also more results. So let me try to find that here. There we go. Right, so when you go to this technical appendix, they list out every little equation that they use in the code. Okay? So they give you the full set of equations. So they give you the production function now with capital and labor. They give you the capital labor ratio, the definition of marginal cost. So now marginal costs are a function of the rental rate on capital and the real wage. They give you the Phillips curve, the New Keynesian-Phillips curve, with the shifter, with the shock to the New Keynesian-Phillips curve, this kind of, these types of shocks that we have in here. They give you the savers and the hand-to-mouthers, first order condition for consumption. So that's the optimal consumption choice for the savers, and then for the non-savers as well. This is a type of Euler equation. Here they have an equation that is summarizing the maturity structure of government debt. There is more first order conditions. There is the investment decisions. So the savers here are the rich households, and they own the capital stock, so they invest in capital. So that's their optimal investment decision into capital. You see, these equations are more involved, but they have a very similar structure to the type of equations that we've been studying. We have the wage Phillips curve. So this is the wage Phillips curve. There is aggregate consumption. It's now the sum of savers' consumption weighted by population share and non-savers, or the hand-to-mouthers. Aggregate resources, the government budget constraint, fiscal rules, monetary rule. So long story short, if you really are into this model now, if you're saying, oh my God, it's too good to be true. I cannot find sleep at night because I want to just work with this model for whatever reason. Then you could fire up a linear session and you could just type in these equations. That's nothing that you would. That's now an impossibility for you guys. So you could have, and this is another optional thing, of course. Task number 4, is you could try to replicate. That is task number 4. task number 4 could be to, it's optional. I will not pester you with that in any way, but you could, replicate the quantitative model. In Dynamic. Okay, so that would be another, if you want to study this deeper, you could just type in those equations, and then you will get the impulse responses that we're going to discuss next. That's the idea. All right. Any questions so far? So far, so good. Don't feel like we're making our way in. So then, what they do is they do the same as the Sahu, Smets, and Fermandel. They're not calibrating parameters, but they're estimating parameters, and they do the very similar econometric technique to estimate the model parameters. It's maximum likelihood. So they have the same type of approach in pinning down the model parameters. And what they do though is, remember how many time series did Sahu, Smets, and Fermandel use in their analysis? Do you remember how many time series they used to estimate the model? Somebody still remember? 4, right? So they used the GDP growth, inflation, the interest rate, and emissions growth, right? Those were the 4. These guys, they used 21 time series. There's reasons for that, right? But they used 21 time series to do that. And they do that in order to be able to identify parameters. So they use standard macroeconomic time series, right? They use GDP, consumption, they use investment data because they have capital in their model. So they need investment data to be able to identify parameters coming from that capital part. They have hours worked, inflation, and wages, so that's to identify the 2 Phillips curves, the price Phillips curve and the wage Phillips curve. Then, because they have a lot of fiscal variables in the model, they need also data for fiscal variables. So they use data for transfers, for government consumption and investment, and for the debt to GDP ratio. So they use like 3 time series for fiscal, to identify the fiscal parameters of that model. Okay. So that's the fiscal, data to match the model to. So they're really giving the model a hard time. And then they use some more monetary policy data, the federal funds rate, and because there is this zero lower bound episode after the financial crisis, they are also using, forward rates beyond our course at all. We cannot talk about that. But think about these are data. You need to think about the monetary part. Monetary part. Okay, the monetary policy. So that's basically the bottom line. So they have lots of data they're using. And then they are estimating it. They do 2 samples. They do the pre-financial crisis sample, right? So they estimate the model pre-financial crisis and then post-financial crisis. It's beyond our task to understand this deeply. The bottom line is at the end of the day, they get a set of parameters, and if you go to the paper, they spell out all the parameter estimates, and you can discuss what these parameter estimates are. So they have now estimates for phi m and phi f and gamma m and gamma f. They have all these parameters now, right? So and also lots of other model parameters. And then they do exactly what we've been doing in this course all week long. You now try to go and understand how do the impulse responses look like? What's the transmission of shocks? And then they simulate the model and look at what does the model tell us about the data. That's basically the analysis that the authors do. So here is the impulse responses they're showing us. So these are the impulse responses. These are impulse responses for 3 shocks. So it's an impulse response for a funded transfer shock. So there's I'm giving Hui money, and I'm funding that with future tax increases. That's what this is. Then there's an unfunded tax shock. I'm giving 2, money, but I don't have plans to raise taxes in the future. So that's the black line and that's the blue line. And then the last one is a shock to the Phillips curve shifter, aka a cost push shock. And they just compare the dynamics of the model to these shocks. And so here's how this goes. This black line here is the impulse response to this zeta z comma t shock that is funded. That's the M shock. What does this say? Well, in terms of inflation, right? When an unfunded shock hits, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about inflation. You know, if Hui gets money and that is backed by future tax changes, inflation is moving by a teeny tiny amount because the model is more complicated, right? But notice, like in the Fisherian model, this was exactly equal to zero, and now it's slightly different from zero because of capital and labor and a lot of other things adjusting, right? But it's like quantitatively, you can forget about that. So impulse response, I want to maybe add, is the impulse responses of the estimated model. So this is not just a calibrated model of the estimated model. There we go. By contrast, and if you are paying out transfers that are unfunded, look at how big of an inflation effect you're getting. So this is now zeta t comma z f for unfunded. Look at what we are getting. Like we're getting a big inflation, and it's also very persistent. That's an important insight from the model. That the estimated model, to the extent that such a shock hits, gets you very different impulse responses. Okay. So that's something to be really, be aware of. Now, when people looked at that the first time, they said, "Oh, this looks interesting, really cool." But wait a second. High inflation, right? I can produce also with other shocks. I can produce high inflation with other shocks as well. And so one such shock is the so-called cost push shock. And that's this red line. And they use this and say, okay, I could use a cost push shock. And that will also deliver persistent inflation. I mean, look at this is 2.5 years here. This is 5 years. Right? This is 10 years. So that will also move inflation persistently around. And that's exactly the question that some people had said, okay, isn't this fiscal unfunded shock business nothing else and it looks like a Phillips curve shift? Doesn't this look like a cost push shock essentially in terms of the data? Aren't we just relabeling stuff? Isn't this just like a more fancy way of generating a cost push shock? So this is cost push. And here's where they say no. There's a distinct difference between a cost push shock and an unfunded government transfer shock. And that's why they call that identification. Because the data would be able to distinguish these two types of shocks. Because the cost push shock is going to have an implication that drives up the real interest rate. Because when the cost push shock hits, we know inflation goes up. And the central bank is going to fight that by raising the normal interest rate. So inflation shoots up, the normal interest rate goes up by even more, so the real interest rate goes up. That is the cost push shock implied response. So this is cost push. But the fiscal expansion, right, this is the unfunded fiscal expansion, leads to a fall in the real interest rate. So these two shocks are not the same. The cost push shock is a different shock. The cost push shock is a different shock than the fiscally unfunded shock. So that's important to keep in mind. So it's not the relabeling the shock that we already knew. No, these shocks are qualitatively different types of shocks. And the data will tell us how important these shocks are. On top of all of this, you see that the debt to GDP ratio can actually fall for the unfunded transfer shock, while all the other shocks actually increase the debt to GDP ratio. Isn't that interesting as well? We know this result, right? Because if the prices go up by more than debt goes up, the government ends up with less debt in terms of GDP. So long story short, the purpose of this slide is to convince the audience that this unfunded shock generates persistent inflation and is a different type of shock than, say, the cost push shock. That's the reason why this slide exists. Okay, any questions? So then the paper, and I'm not going to continue going through this step by step, and I'm going to leave out a couple of graphs, but we're going to go over this a little faster. Here they show some of the data. So this is the data on transfers, and so you see there's a big trend in the data for transfers. Right? There's the black is the actual transfers in the data. So the U.S. economy has increased transfers over that sample of 60 years, and so they take out a trend and then they compare the unfunded transfers. So when they have used the model and extracted what is the unfunded transfers against the real interest rate, and you see there is this very always opposite movement that when the unfunded transfers are down, the real rate is up. So there's always a strong negative correlation in the data between those two objects. Okay, so that means this is the real rate, and this is the unfunded transfers that they have estimated. Z. So this is ZT, zeta. Unfunded transfers. Unfunded transfers. So you can use, once you have estimated the model, you can get the estimation is going to give you a time series for Z, zeta Z, TF. That's what the estimation is going to produce for you. Okay? So it's going to spit out a time series for this zeta ZT. And what you see is that there was a big increase in transfers in the 60s. Right? Look at that. I mean, the unfunded transfers went up a lot in the 60s. It came down subsequently. But then there's some interesting stuff going on toward the end of the sample, and we'll get back to that. But if you compare that to the data real interest rate, you're going to see this very big negative correlation. -6 is not very big, but it's a sizable negative correlation. Going back to exactly this, that that these two, when the fiscal funded shock goes up, the transfer shock goes up, the debt to GDP ratio falls, and the real interest rate falls. That's exactly that negative correlation. Okay. And then they go through a phases, so they have like 4 slides where they don't go and say, okay, let me plot the data, and then this is the transfer, and then they do the following, they do a so-called counterfactual analysis. So the estimation is giving them a time series for zeta F, Z, T, and the time series for zeta Z, T, M. Right, that's the estimation. It's going to spit out these time series to you. And then what they do is they say, okay, let me use one time series at a time only and simulate the model with that. So I'm going to take the funded time series for the funded transfer shock. That's this one. Sorry, it's the other way around. So the unfunded time series is this one, and the other one is this one. And so they are, simulating the model one by one. And what you see is that, lots of in other words, what happens is that the share of funded transfers has been, falling, right? This becomes smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of contribution to the overall transfers. And the share of the unfunded transfers has been rising. So long story short, at the end of the sample, the importance of funded to unfunded for total transfers is roughly 50-50. So unfunded transfers have become more popular. There's a larger portion of total transfers that is unfunded relative to funded. Historically, back in the days, it was the opposite. It was like most of the transfers were actually funded. So the governments made sure to fund their transfers, and there was a very small portion according to the model's analysis. So that's something to keep in mind. And then they look at subsamples, right? So this is sorry, I should be careful. This is only in the, until 75. Okay, so this is what they call the run-up of the great welfare state in the 1960s and 70s. This increase in transfers. So this is all the 60s and 70s. And then they look at more recent data, and the trend continues that the share of unfunded, that's the 1990s to 2020, and here we have the 2020 to 2023. You can think about this as the CARES Act, right? The first part of the CARES Act, and then the later part is the ARPA Act. So you can use the model to study all these episodes. And the basic bottom line is that they identify 4 phases. There is this large rise in unfunded transfers in the 70s. Right? This is like this run-up of the gray area up here. Right? And then they show that starting from the 70s to the 90s, it was relatively stable. I mean, there wasn't big, lots of action happening there. The third phase is then the 1990s. We had again a run-up in predominantly funded transfers that were driving the dynamics. But then comes the lion's share that in the COVID stimulus package, there we have they're making the point that needs some more deeper analysis. And so that's what they want to do then. They want to look deeper into this total transfer divvy up there. And that's what we have here. So this is one of their key plots, and I think that's one of the plots why they are actually gotten this paper into the QJE. Okay? That is my interpretation of it. So what is this doing here? The red line is the actual rate of inflation. So that is inflation. That's inflation now. So this is the observed rate of inflation in the United States. We've seen this plot in the motivation slides that I gave you for this entire slide deck. So what are now these other things? Now these bars, the black bars are the importance of unfunded transfer shocks for the dynamics of inflation. And the light ones are all the other shocks. Okay, so what is this? What they do is the following. They take the model and they simulate the model using all the shocks. That's going to give them the red line. And then they're going to take the model and they're going to set one shock. They set all the shocks away except for one shock, namely the time series for the unfunded debt. And when they feed that into the model, that's the rate of inflation that's going to result. So this is, the black is the rate of inflation implied by unfunded shocks only. So let's write this down. So the black is the rate of inflation implied by unfunded transfer shocks only. Okay. So that's important. So this is, in other words, if you're simulating, you take the model as the model is, and you're sticking in this time series for the unfunded shocks. Where is this? There. You're sticking in this time series for the unfunded shocks, and you're going to get these black lines for inflation. Okay? So what is the takeaway from this? These unfunded shocks were incredibly important in the 1960s and 70s for the rate of inflation. Unfunded shocks alone account for a big part of the overall dynamics of inflation. So in other words, inflation went up to like 6, 8, 9% in the data, 10%, and just the unfunded transfer shocks, they contributed largely to inflation. There's not so much happening here, but then here again, look at that. At the end of the sample, let's zoom in into the end of the sample. When the way they argue this is the CARES Act. The CARES Act didn't really contribute a lot to inflation, but the ARPA stimulus package contributed a lot to inflation. So in other words, they argue through the lens of their model. It's these unfunded transfer shocks that are the most important shocks that drive inflation. That's the idea. So in other words, the analysis suggests that their fiscal inflation is important to account for the actual observed inflation. That's the basic model. So it supports the idea that the U.S. rate of inflation is driven, at times dramatically by unfunded fiscal shocks. That's what you have to do. That's how you have to think about it. Are there any questions? Do you have any questions on this? Technically or intuitively? Do you have an understanding how this plot is produced? Intuitively? You take the model and you send in the time series for unfunded shocks into this model as the only time series or as the only shocks, and then you simulate the model, and that's going to give you this black line. That's what this is. And so it's the inflation rate implied by the model if you only put in the unfunded shocks. But of course, the model has 21 time series and 21 shocks, so there is 20 other shocks. Right? We have 21 shocks. So that means we have one unfunded shock and 20 other shocks. This one shock produces this black line. That's how you have to think about that. It's one shock against 20 shocks.
Is it overlap?
What's that?
I mean, what you say, the black area.
Yeah.
Overlap, like all the policy shock is higher than, for example, in the Treasury, is higher.
Right.
Yeah, so is it from the 0 to that?
So you can have also negative shocks, right? Like for instance, you have to think about this red line is now the sum of these gray lines and the black line. So this is, you take this and then you add this. Now this is negative numbers. This plus this is going to give you the red line. So that's how you can think about that. Okay, so the data you will always get by summing all these bars, you're going to get the red line exactly. So I think we should maybe add one important thing here, right? That we have in this estimation slide, we have 21 time series, and we have 21 shocks. That's important. So we have 21 shocks. And one of these shocks seems to be very important for the driving the rate of inflation in the data. Now, the other shocks are important too, at times as well, but not overall, right? So this is what the other shaded areas are. These are the other policy shocks, like monetary policy shock and funded shocks, and then these are other shocks like the technology shock and preference shocks and so forth. All right. So long story short, the reason why this paper got so important or got so much attention is basically because of this graph. It tells us that fiscal policy is important for inflation, not just monetary policy. Okay. So what else then? And they also do this for GDP, so this plot is not so nice to interpret, but this is like the contributions of these unfunded shocks for GDP growth, for growth in the economy. And you see also there that the black lines are also important at times, not overall and always, but at times they are important. So that indicates that unfunded shocks have real effects on GDP that are quantitative. Okay. Last but not least, then they have a few slides where they do what's called counterfactual simulations. They do counterfactual simulations. So that's the last, there's two sets of simulations they do, and then the paper is done. So in other words, they have the actual data. That's the black lines. So the black lines are the data, and this is, if you like, I think in business administration, you call this a case study. It's a case study. So it's a case study. And the blacks is always the data here, right? So this is hours worked, and this is a rate of inflation. There's a real interest rate, and then there's the federal funds rate. So that's the data. And you see that there's this big run-up in inflation, right? Inflation was about 2 or 0, and then over a short period of time, inflation zoomed up to like 9%. Right? The black line is the big inflation increase. And the model, with all the shocks, with all the 21 shocks, and with the structure of the model, explains all these black lines exactly. And what they then do is they are doing two counterfactual experiments. Okay? So the first is like to understand what is R bar, the R bar. So R bar versus CARES. So the ARPA was put together by Trump in 2020. And the CARES was put together by Biden in 2021 when he was elected. What am I doing here? I'm writing this wrong, sorry. So the ARPA was in 2021 and the CARES was in 2020. These are two acts, two laws in the United States that when COVID hit, Trump did the CARES Act. This acronym I always forget. It's like a COVID rescue whatever package. That was in 2020, and the data identifies it as a funded shock, funded increase in transfers. And then there was the American Rescue Act plan by Biden in 2021, and it's logically, the model says it was unfunded. And now what they do is, and that's embedded in all these black lines. And now they do two experiments. They say, okay, suppose we take the model and we assume the ARPA was fully funded. You can do that. But remember on Monday when I gave you that speech in macroeconomics?
Not funded.
What's that?
The ARPA.
The ARPA.
The ARPA initially
It's not funded.
it's not funded.
Okay. So the ARPA, this was Biden, and it was unfunded. Okay, it was unfunded. That's so to say the ARPA, package that was implemented in 2021, and then the CARES was by Trump, okay, in his first presidency, and it was funded. Okay, so that's what, so to say, the idea is behind those two big CARES Acts. And so the dynamics of the black line embed exactly that. Okay? So the CARES Act dynamics embed exactly that. And now what they do is they say, okay, let's consider what happens if the ARPA would have been funded, right? So we can do this controlled experiment, right? So remember on Monday I told you, I gave you this speech on Monday that in macroeconomics, right, we are trying to explain data. Right? The first thing is we are examining data, we are trying to understand why does the data move. And then the way to do this is we do models. We develop models to do that study. And the reason why we do these models is because we cannot run controlled experiments in our economy. We just cannot do that. For ethical reasons, for practical reasons. So the models are our laboratories to study experiments. The reason why we cannot say, okay, we cannot study, we had the ARPA package, it was whatever it was unfunded, but now I want to understand what if Biden has put the package together in a funded way. I cannot run that controlled experiments because this is history. How can I go back in time and say, let's check this and change this? It's impossible to do, obviously, right? Go back in history like a time machine and tell Biden, do this package in funding, please, because I want to study what the effects are. Just doing that is, of course, crazy. And then, doing an experiment on the economy is crazy as well. So that's why we need our models. Now we can use this model as our laboratory for that very experiment. And that's what happens here. So here we can now study when the ARPA is fully funded. That's the blue lines. How would the US economy have evolved with the ARPA fully funded? And I want to just zoom in on inflation. This is the ARPA fully funded. What does this mean? What does this mean, folks? Can somebody help me? Inflation would go up as much.
Yeah.
Right? Inflation would not have gone up as much. That's the basic bottom line. Inflation would not have gone to 9%. It would also have, be higher than target, but it's this, according to the theory, that difference is because of the ARPA Act not being not fully funded. That's the key. And then they, redo this, and now they do two things. They say the CARES Act and the ARPA, if everything has been fully funded, like completely, then inflation basically wouldn't have moved much. So even the CARES Act did produce some extra inflation. But so long story short, the idea is CARES and ARPA. If you think carefully, what is the contribution? This is CARES and ARPA fully funded, and then if you make the ARPA Act unfunded, we're going to do that. Okay, control to the absolute increase in inflation. So long story short, the analysis here suggests that the ARPA was really important. The funding decisions by ARPA was important for the inflation dynamics. That's the dogmatic basically. Of course, it's a very, this is politically, of course, a very charged, statement, of course. But that's what the analysis tells us. Now then they do also some out-of-sample forecasting, right? They say, okay, let's suppose we are in 2020, right? And then they do a forecast. So they don't give the model all this data, but they say that the last observation that they give the model is this, and that, and that, and that. That's the last observation. And then they say, let's forecast the data. And what they show is that their full model, the red line, is pretty good in forecasting inflation. So the model gets inflation pretty well with the ARPA package that was decided. So in other words, if Biden would have approached these people and they say, look, I'm planning to do this ARPA package, tell me what the inflation effects are, they would predict pretty well what the US rate of inflation would have looked like at the time. And this is the forecast without, so you can think about this is the ARPA effect on inflation. So the model is pretty good in forecasting actually. It's for fiscal policymakers something that is really really a striking thing. Any questions? All right, I'm nearing the grand finale here. What the authors then also do is that this is what typically referees ask the authors of. You have shown us all these interesting results, but how robust are the analysis? So they do a whole sequence of analysis. They say, look, let me add this, let me take this away. So they kind of cut their model in the sense of, okay, let me take away price rigidities and redo everything. Let me take away capital accumulation and redo everything. How different are the results looking at? So to see what's isolating the most important features of their model, for generating the results. And I'm not so fond of this graph, which basically shows this is the quantitative model, right? This is the stylized model, and then it seems like that the stylized model does a pretty good job, but I'm a little doubtful on that, so let's leave that maybe for now. Then they have also some more impulse responses based on theoretical, theory-free evidence. So this is based on time series. Okay, this is a time series evidence again. Let's not dig too much into this, I would suppose. But let's maybe finish this slide by going through this conclusion slide. Because I think that's an important slide to conclusions to discuss. Okay? So what have we learned from this paper? What are the things that this paper offers to us when thinking about the theory of persistent inflation? The one thing to be, as a takeaway, if somebody wakes you up in the middle of the night and asks you, so what did Facchini, Bianchi, and Melosi do? Well, they basically argue that the lion's share of inflation fluctuations in the United States is driven by a thing called partially unfunded shocks. Fiscal shocks, partially unfunded fiscal shocks. That's their take. That's their line. So, and they argue these unfunded shocks are, critically affecting inflation and output dynamics. they have been so important that they actually contributed to inflation, that without these shocks, we would have been in deflation mode for a long time already, right? It's like the standard, shocks would have driven inflation below zero, and it's these unfunded shocks that have made inflation come up so that what we have observed. So these shocks actually counteracted deflationary forces coming elsewhere in the economy. And then the fiscal inflation has really something strongly connected to the pandemic. But even there, the devil's in the detail, right? It depends on whether you have, which part of the time of the historical episodes you're looking at. Whether you're looking at the first element or the first year of the pandemic versus all subsequent years. There already you get a sharp distinction of how much inflation was generated by funded versus unfunded shocks. And then this one is more like an outlook onto the future. And I mean, this paper was written or published in 2023. Now we stand in 2026, and these things kind of have happened ever since they wrote this paper. So this is more like an outlook going forward, with the idea that, well, we need a credible fiscal plan to avoid. Of course, they're saying, these unfunded shocks, they're not good. These are not good, these unfunded shocks, because they create inflation, and inflation is bad for society. It creates tensions among the society. People suffer when their daily needs, their daily food gets more expensive and they can't afford that anymore. It creates political tension in a sense of, parties, extremist parties gaining voter shares and so forth. So they say, to avoid this, we need better, credible fiscal plans. We need plans that are sound. Okay? But in order to formulate a credible fiscal plan, we need a model like this to display, to forecast what an unfunded, shock actually may produce to the economy. We need a framework like that to be able to analyze quantitatively that this is a tax proposal that will get you lots of inflation. Be careful with that. Have a backup plan. Right? And the same is true for the central bank, namely, do we want to give central bank independence or not? It's a huge debate, of course, right? The central bank independence, we had all these interviews on Powell and others and the pressure, that if you take away central bank independence, you're going to imply that you're going to be more often in the fiscally led type regime. Right? That's the key idea. If you instruct the central bank to, you guys keep the interest rate low, now and for long, that's exactly the type of independence that you take away from the central bank that will end up with more inflation afterwards. This is the discussion on central bank independence. Now, by 2023, the Russian invasion of Ukraine already happened at the time, right? They had that in mind, but of course this whole thing gets even more important when you think about the war that happened in Gaza, and now the war in Iran, right? The geopolitical risks, they require, ambitious fiscal plans, like the arming of Western European armies, the German debt break, right? We motivated this entire paper by that the German, the parliament has voted to relax the German debt break, to have more infrastructure and defense spending. All this maps into, if there are geopolitical risks that require massive fiscal spending, we should be prepared that if this massive fiscal spending isn't backed by future tax changes, it can produce a lot of inflation, according to this theory. So that is the key idea, behind this. Okay, so seems very relevant to me. Are there any questions from your side? Yeah.
Slide
24. Mm-hmm.
So, where the gap between the 24.
24. Here, I see. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
So where the gap between in graph of inflation, so
Yeah.
where fully fund.
Yes.
The low ages are fully fund.
Yes.
So, what I mean with the blue line. So how about care is also fully funded?
So that's the thing. And so you have to refine this. So this is when I said what I wrote here. When I wrote this, the text here. When I said funded or unfunded, that's when you read like when you read the text, when you read the bill, or if you go on Wikipedia and you read what that bill is. That's what the perception by the profession or the economist was. That largely, maybe that's better. Write it like this. That's largely unfunded, or largely. So the profession assessed these two bills to be largely unfunded or largely funded. That's so to say the perception. The analysis here, it's a little more nuanced here. Actually, it turns out that the CARES Act also had elements of unfunding. That's one way to basically read this. Okay, and so that's actually questions that. Okay, so when I put these into quotation marks, this is like the conventional wisdom. Let's say it this way. This is the conventional wisdom. Okay. So that basically means that this conventional wisdom has to be rewritten also, that even the CARES Act also produced some extra inflation. So it's not that the CARES Act is completely funded, but it's funded to a larger degree. And it's only a little intricacy here. The reason why this is a little difficult to understand the red line is that that red line starts to move earlier than the blue line. The red line starts to, in 2020 to move different from the data. The blue line starts to move differently only 1 year later. And so that makes it a little hard to compare, these two lines. So I think the bottom line for you to take away is that this blue line is just going to tell you that had the ARPA Act, that's going to be the easiest, had the ARPA Act been fully funded, then we would have seen less inflation. And then also, had the CARES Act been fully funded completely, if both of, if the entire spending by the US government through the lens of this model had been completely funded, the US economy would not have seen, this huge bout of inflation. That's one way to basically, that's a robust kind of thing. Okay. All right. Other questions?
It's interesting because the gap, the pot gap between the black and the blue, and also the gap between the blue and the red is also, at the time of COVID 2022 is the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, although one just partly fund and one partly
That's right.
unfunded.
That's right. No, absolutely. Now, I want to finish with you in a similar vein of what we did with the macroclimate paper. I don't want to leave you here with, this paper has been written, and that's the final word of wisdom. Because I want to put this maybe in a little bigger context. Are there any other views about what drove inflation, and are there maybe any upside potential on this paper? Okay, we think about improving perhaps, or extending the analysis, relative, similar to the macroclimate paper. So let's think a little bit as a group about, is there any upside potential, or what are the shortcomings, quote unquote, on this paper? Can we identify maybe something? It's a super strong paper, and it's in the top journal, don't get me wrong. But what are possible shortcomings, or where's upside potential on this paper? What do you think?
Just my view.
Mm-hmm.
Given the fact that here, we have a very long horizon of data, right? Over 70 years, right?
Yeah.
And then for our policymaker, both from the fiscal side and for the monetary, their parameter is constant, not time varying, right? I think usually you would have they change their view frequently. So maybe having that part to be time invariant, maybe for me is something
I like that name, right? So we have the same fiscal policy set up for the last 60 years, right? So that's a constant parameter. There's no different types of fiscal policies. I mean, Alan Auerbach is a very famous macroeconomist. He's arguing there's been like 7, 8 different fiscal regimes in the last 60 years in the US. So we have the same fiscal policy set up in the sense of they are like all constant parameters for fiscal policy, for fiscal policy in the last 60 years. 60 years. That is something I totally agree, right? That one could refine that. You could think about that maybe fiscal policy in the 60s was completely differently structured than the fiscal policy under Biden and Trump. And the paper assumes, no, they have the same type of feedback rule, right? The fiscal rule has the same structure. So the fiscal rule has the same structure. Over 60 years. Okay, any other views?
I think about the two-case scenario when we try to assume the carers or around the carers fully funded. So I think maybe we can try with another ratio between like partially unfunded, but with more realistic ratio, maybe like 25% for the
I see.
unfunded and 75%
Okay.
to maybe find the optimal ratio for the certain period of time.
That's an interesting question. So you want to think about what's optimal. I love that. What is, say, optimal, shares of funded, that's a great idea, funded versus unfunded shocks. That's a great idea. I like that very much. Okay. Oh, we need 5 more minutes, then we're done. Okay, that's great. Other thoughts? There we go. All right, so this is US centric. How about other countries? And that's actually opened now the gates for an interesting consideration. This paper argues most of the recent inflation in the US is driven by fiscal policy. That's what this paper argues. But there is a competing view to that view, namely that no, it's not fiscal policy that has elevated inflation. There are supply side damages because of COVID that has led to this rise in inflation. Like for instance, right, the supply side damages from harbor closures in China, zero policy, policies and zero COVID policies in China. The disruptions of supply side chains that we have observed during the COVID area. We couldn't get stuff shipped because of the harbors were closed. Then we had the increase in energy and oil prices in Ukraine that have increased firms' production costs dramatically. This competing view argues, no, it's those things that have led inflation to go up so much, not the fiscal action. And that competing view is not reflected here. So in other words, let's maybe write this down carefully, right? This is US-centric in a sense of that all inflation post-COVID was driven by unfunded fiscal shocks, right? So the paper takes exactly that idea, right? So in other words, if we think about that inflation went up globally across, we saw inflation going up in not only the US, but in Germany, in France, in Vietnam, everywhere, in China, everywhere inflation went up. So through the lens of this paper, this must mean that everywhere on this globe we had governments behaving irresponsibly, increasing transfers unfunded. And is that actually true? That's not, the paper doesn't show that. There's actually a good case to be made to say, look, no, the fiscal response to COVID was very heterogeneous. the fiscal response in China versus Sweden versus the US, Germany, and Vietnam was very dispersed, very different. So in other words, if this paper is 100% true, we should have seen the same big run-up in inflation everywhere, right? Because, and it must all be driven by unfunded shocks. So long story short, there is full length of this global inflation, global post-COVID inflation that we had. We had a lot of inflation post-COVID around the globe. Must have been driven everywhere in all countries by unfunded shocks. Driven in all countries by unfunded shocks. And I'm going to put a big question mark on that. Okay? It's not clear that through the lens of this model, unfunded shocks in China, in Vietnam, and other countries were the major drivers of inflation. So that's why the paper, so in other words, one has to then apply this paper to other countries and see what's now the conclusion. Okay. Because there is this big competing view, right? There is a competing view that this inflation was not driven by fiscal, but this was driven by supply side disruptions. The competing view is that global inflation, global post-COVID inflation was driven by supply chain disruptions and war, and the Russian-Ukraine war, the Russian-Ukraine war. Okay? So that is the key idea, that there is this competing view out there that didn't have much to do. I mean, inflation in Germany didn't have much to do with unfunded fiscal shocks, because we were affected so badly by the run-up in energy and oil prices because Russia invading Ukraine. And China closes its harbors, ships cannot leave, so that all the supply side, that you cannot manufacture your cars because you're missing the intermediate inputs from China. So that is the competing view that we have in the profession, that this paper emphasizes the fiscal notion, and by logic, this must, if inflation was high everywhere on the globe, then that means by this paper, we must have had unfunded fiscal shocks everywhere on the globe, which is highly unlikely. And the competing view is that, so this paper possibly lacks on integrating these supply chain disruptions, right? So had the model had supply side chain disruptions, it would possibly give more prominence to that, like oil prices and stuff like that. But that's of course conjecturing, and not, I'm not here in a position to say this is true or not, and that's why I really want to say, look, this is the upside potential. This is not a shortcoming yet. So this is something that needs to be researched. So a master thesis could, for instance, or further research could apply this model to other countries, compare what is the implications of this model for other countries, or could extend the model to incorporate the competing view, and then have a horse race between the funded shocks versus other countries. Okay. So let's, there's of course more to discuss, but of course in the interest of time, folks, I'm inclined to start, putting an end to this course in a sense of finalizing this course. Are there any questions from your side? Let me wrap up and maybe say two things. First of all, here is our Moodle page. I'll just do that really quick. I want to use maybe 2 minutes and then we're going to get out of here. I'm going to do this. We're just setting this whole course in a bigger context again. Okay, so 2 weeks ago we met the very first time here in class, and I think we've come pretty far with covering exciting material. So we started on Monday last week with reviewing the basic New Keynesian models and familiarizing ourselves with what are the basic transmission mechanisms in the basic New Keynesian model, the channel. But we also studied like caused push shocks and the transmission of shocks. So that was the first block of this course, and basically bringing everybody up to speed. And then we launched into this macroclimate block, where for 4 to 5 days we've been studying hard to think about what are the climate change implications for inflation in a model that quantifies that. When we studied things like greenflation and climate-inflation, familiarized ourselves with a non-linear New Keynesian model, and then we spent a lot of time in implementing the computer codes and working with the computer codes underlying this. So this was a class that was not just theoretical, but it was also practical in terms of working with computer codes. And then the last couple of days, we've been busy with working on the monetary fiscal interaction, another very hot topic in macro, thinking about when and under which conditions does fiscal policy contribute to inflation. And again, I've equipped you with now with computer codes that you can use to make strides on following this if you're interested. So I think overall we've come quite far in terms of this course. There's typically at this point a question about the exam. Okay, so you're going to write the exam in 2 weeks from now, right? So it's the 27th of March. Okay, and I gave you this mock exam as an example for the type of questions that you can expect, and I also gave you the solution. So the actual exam will have a very similar structure and also type of questions than the mock exam. What's relevant for the exam is everything that we covered here in class. Everything we discussed here in class is relevant for the exam. So all the slides and all the computer codes that we discussed here are relevant for the exam. I don't expect things beyond the slide content. Okay, so I will not ask things that we haven't actually discussed in terms of slides. I will ask you to maybe make sure that you can convey that you understand the slide content, and then I will also give you small problems that maybe ask you to apply what you learned from the slides and apply that to a slightly different setup, and making sure that you are able to transfer the knowledge. That's the idea. But if you follow this course closely here and you are on top of the material and the codes, then you should not be nervous about the exam. Okay, that's the idea. Are there any questions regarding the exam? So this is a 90-minute exam, right? You're always writing 90-minute exams, right? It's going to be English, so bring a pocket calculator. I don't know whether you need one, but just bring one in case. It's closed book, so no computers, no notes, and bring something to write on. And then I'm going to have you, there's going to be a printout. You're going to write in person here, right? So there's going to be a printout.
Yeah.
You're going to get a printout, and you're going to get paper to write your answers on, and then use the printout. And on the printout, there may also be stuff that you need to write directly on the printout. So when you hand in the exam, hand in your exam where you wrote lots of text papers, but also hand in the exam question papers as well, because I may ask you to actually do something on the exam papers as well. I may give you something to do on the exam papers. But these instructions are also written then on the actual exam. There will be no computer, but the computer work we did is going to be relevant. So I'm going to ask you stuff about MATLAB and Dynair, the things that we discussed here, the codes that we wrote. Okay? So I may give you some Dynair code and ask you to find mistakes in that Dynair code. Or I may give you Dynair code and ask you to complete Dynair code. Like write in on the exam question paper, like a small little commands here and there and stuff like that. Okay, that's the idea. I may give you output from Dynair, asking you to interpret that output or tell me what that output means, and so forth. Okay. All right. Are there any questions left over here? Are you completely sure about everything? Then I like to thank you very much for coming here to class in the last 2 weeks. It's been really exciting to work together with you. I treasure very fond memories from the last 2 weeks and the classroom interaction that we had, and also the outside the classroom interaction, like the wonderful lunch that we shared and some of the informal lunches that we had. I really appreciate that opportunity to talk and teach you, and I wish you best of luck not only for the upcoming exams, but for the remainder of your master studies, and then for your professional careers and life going forward. I'm sure that I may see some of you at some point in your lives, and I'm looking forward to that opportunity. In case we don't see each other again, best of luck, and thanks a lot for this very exciting and wonderful class. It's been a great experience. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Tui, for all the support in so many ways. I mean, thank you so much. It's been really important in so many ways. Thank you so much. Okay, great. There was a photographer. Is she gonna come in here or? More students?
I know, it's a tech photos, how to take photos, and we can have some professional photographer, I guess.
So then let me fire this up again here. We have I think we should have a background here. Let's see.
Chắc là mình đi lên một xíu cho không bị dính cái ánh sáng.
Hello. Alright, so everyone come on board. So let's do a farewell photograph. Try to make sure to have my shirt.
Maybe this is the last time they gather together.
Yeah.
Because this is the last course.
It's your last course also, right? Exactly. This is great. I mean, so let's. I should stand a little bit.
Yeah, yes.
Like this?
To avoid being cast by the light.
Yeah,
all of that.
I see. Yeah, let's get together. And okay. So we're gonna do this. Are we?
Smile.
Wait. So.
Which camera should we?
This is the main camera.
Yeah.
Can you move back a little bit? Just a little. Okay.
This?
Yeah. Ánh sát cho một xíu. Dạ rồi. So, okay. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh.
Some more. Let's go on. Come here. Come on.
Closer.
Closer. We need to get closer. Come on. Let's get a little closer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Like okay. First formal and then fun.
1, 2, 3.
Yay! Come on, everyone.
1, 2, 3. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Could you send me a copy of that picture? Would it be possible to receive a picture? And somebody took a picture also when we had the lunch in the vegetarian restaurant. Could I get a picture? Just for memory, that would be great. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye. Ciao.